All right, so let's talk about something that most people genuinely don't think about when they think about war. When the average person imagines conflict between nations, the images that come to mind are dramatic and visual. Missiles streaking across the sky, tanks rolling across deserts, aircraft carriers floating like moving cities on the ocean, fighter jets screaming overhead, explosions lighting up the night. War, in the popular imagination, is something loud and physical. It is something you can watch on television or see in the headlines the next morning. But that way of thinking about conflict is increasingly outdated. The world we live in today operates on a much more complex set of systems, and the most decisive battles are often invisible to the naked eye. If you want to understand how power actually works in modern geopolitics, you have to stop focusing only on the battlefield and start paying attention to the financial system. Because in the modern world, the global financial architecture is arguably the most important battlefield of all. Once you begin to look at global politics through that lens, a lot of things that once seemed confusing begin to make sense. Countries that appear militarily weak sometimes behave with surprising confidence. Alliances that look strange at first glance start to reveal their deeper logic. Even conflicts that appear to be about ideology or religion often turn out to be driven by far more practical considerations involving money, trade, and economic survival. When you step back and examine the structure of the modern global economy, you start to realize that military power is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Iran provides one of the most fascinating case studies of this dynamic. From a purely conventional military perspective, Iran is not in the same league as the United States. The numbers alone make that clear. The United States spends roughly $800 billion every year on its military. That is an amount so large that it exceeds the combined defense budgets of many of the world's major powers. Iran, by comparison, spends somewhere in the range of $20 to $25 billion annually. The gap is enormous. It is the difference between a superpower and a regional power. If you were sitting in Tehran and evaluating this balance of power honestly, you would immediately recognize a simple reality. A conventional military confrontation with the United States would almost certainly end in defeat. The United States possesses overwhelming advantages in air power, naval strength, satellite surveillance, cyber capabilities, and logistics. Fighting a direct war under those conditions would be strategically irrational. But intelligent, strategic thinkers rarely limit themselves to one type of competition. If you cannot win a confrontation in one arena, you look for another arena where the balance of power is more favorable. This is where Iran's thinking becomes interesting. Instead of asking how to defeat the United States on the battlefield, Iranian strategists began asking a different question entirely. What if the real vulnerability of American power is not its military strength, but the financial system that supports it? To understand that possibility, you have to understand the structure of the global oil market and something known as the petrodollar system. The term itself sounds technical, but the underlying concept is relatively straightforward. For roughly the last half-century, the majority of global oil transactions have been conducted in U.S. dollars when major oil-producing countries sell their energy resources on international markets. The deals are typically priced and settled using American currency. This arrangement did not happen by accident. Over time, it became the foundation of a powerful economic cycle. Oil exporting countries earn massive amounts of dollars by selling energy. Those dollars then flow back into the American financial system because the exporting countries need somewhere stable to invest their wealth. They purchase U.S. Treasury bonds, American stocks, and various other assets tied to the U.S. economy. The result is a feedback loop that continuously reinforces the strength of the American financial system. Global demand for oil creates global demand for dollars. Global demand for dollars allows the United States to maintain its position as the center of the international financial system. As long as that cycle continues, the United States enjoys a remarkable advantage. It can run large budget deficits and issue large amounts of debt, while still maintaining global confidence in its currency. The countries most deeply embedded in this system are the Gulf Cooperation Council states. Nations such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman sit atop some of the largest energy reserves on Earth. Over decades of oil exports, they have accumulated immense financial resources. Their sovereign wealth funds now rank among the most powerful investment vehicles in the global economy. These funds invest heavily in the United States. They hold substantial stakes in American technology giants, major financial institutions, and large segments of the American stock market. They also purchase large quantities of U.S. government debt, effectively helping finance American public spending. In many ways, the prosperity of these Gulf states and the stability of the American financial system have become closely intertwined. This is where geography enters the story in a decisive way. If you look at a map of global energy flows, you will notice a narrow waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, known as the Strait of Hormuz. It is one of the most important maritime choke points in the world. A significant percentage of the world's oil supply passes through that narrow corridor every single day as tankers carry energy from Gulf producers to markets in Asia, Europe, and beyond. And positioned directly along the northern coastline of that choke point is Iran. Iran's location gives it a strategic advantage that does not depend on matching the United States ship for ship or aircraft for aircraft. Instead, it allows Iran to threaten the flow of energy through one of the most critical arteries of the global economy. The tools required to create such disruption are not especially expensive. Relatively inexpensive drones, anti-ship missiles, naval mines, and fast attack boats can all pose serious risks to commercial shipping if used strategically. Even the perception of danger in such a narrow passage can have enormous economic consequences. If energy shipments through the Strait of Hormuz were significantly disrupted, oil prices would likely surge almost immediately. Shipping companies would become reluctant to send tankers through the region. Insurance costs for maritime transport would skyrocket. The ripple effects would spread quickly through global energy markets. For the Gulf states, whose economies rely heavily on exporting oil, such disruption could become extremely damaging. Their national budgets depend on steady energy revenue. Any prolonged interruption in exports would strain their financial stability. Domestic political pressures could increase if governments found themselves unable to maintain economic benefits that populations had come to expect. This is where the second layer of consequences begins to emerge. When oil revenues decline, the investment flows tied to those revenues also begin to slow. Sovereign wealth funds that once poured billions of dollars into foreign markets may suddenly become more cautious. Instead of expanding their global portfolios, they might focus more on preserving liquidity and stabilizing their own economies. If that shift were large enough, it could affect the broader petrodollar cycle. The steady stream of capital flowing from Gulf energy profits into American financial markets could weaken. While the United States has many other sources of investment, even a partial disruption of such flows could create pressure in key areas of the financial system. The American economy today is deeply connected to its financial markets. Retirement funds, pension systems, and large portions of middle-class wealth are tied to the performance of stocks and bonds. When financial markets remain stable and growing, that wealth effect helps sustain consumer spending and economic confidence. When markets become unstable, the effects spread through the entire economy. From Iran's perspective, this dynamic offers a form of leverage that does not rely on defeating American forces in battle. Instead, it focuses on creating strategic pressure points within the global economic system. The objective is not a sudden victory, but a gradual accumulation of stress across interconnected systems. Iran is also not acting entirely alone in questioning the structure of the existing financial order. In recent years, several major powers have begun exploring alternatives to dollar-dominated trade networks. Russia has experimented with selling energy in non-dollar currencies. China has promoted greater international use of its own currency and developed new financial institutions designed to support alternative trade arrangements. Across parts of Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, policymakers have also begun discussing the risks of excessive dependence on a single global currency system. While these conversations do not necessarily translate into immediate structural change, they contribute to a slow evolution in how countries think about financial sovereignty. If instability in key energy regions accelerates those conversations, it could gradually encourage the development of parallel financial structures. Over long time horizons, even small shifts in global currency usage can have major consequences. The dominance of a global reserve currency is sustained not just by economic size, but by collective confidence and habit. When those habits begin to change, the underlying system slowly adapts. For the United States, the strength of the dollar and its role in international trade provide enormous strategic advantages. They allow the country to borrow money more easily, maintain large government programs, and exert influence through financial sanctions and regulatory power. Few nations in history have enjoyed such extensive economic leverage, but maintaining that leverage requires protecting the broader architecture that supports it. That is one reason the United States has invested so heavily in maintaining security relationships throughout the Persian Gulf. American naval forces have maintained a continuous presence in the region for decades, ensuring that energy shipments can move through vital choke points without major disruption. These deployments are expensive and sometimes politically controversial, but from a strategic perspective, they serve a clear purpose. They help safeguard the flow of energy that underpins a significant portion of the global financial system. In that sense, military power becomes a tool for protecting economic infrastructure rather than simply defeating enemies on a battlefield. At the same time, the nature of conflict is evolving. Modern technology has made it easier for smaller states to impose costs on larger ones without engaging in direct confrontation. Cyber operations, drone warfare, economic sanctions, and information campaigns all allow relatively limited actors to influence global systems in ways that would have been impossible decades ago. Iran has invested heavily in mastering these forms of asymmetric pressure. Instead of trying to match larger powers symmetrically, it focuses on identifying vulnerabilities within complex systems and applying targeted stress where it can have the greatest impact. The approach requires patience and careful calibration, but it allows weaker states to remain strategically relevant. When you step back and view the entire system as a whole, you begin to see how deeply interconnected modern geopolitics has become. Energy markets influence financial markets. Financial markets shape domestic politics. Political decisions determine military strategy. Military strategy affects the security of trade routes and resources. Each element feeds into the others in a continuous loop. This means that the struggle shaping the 21st century is not simply a contest of armies or weapons. It is a competition over systems. Whoever exerts the greatest influence over global trade networks, financial flows, energy supply chains, and technological infrastructure will hold the most durable form of power. In that context, many of the tensions we observe today begin to look less like isolated conflicts and more like pieces of a much larger transformation. Countries are testing the boundaries of existing institutions, experimenting with new alliances, and exploring alternative economic frameworks. None of these shifts happen overnight. Structural changes in the global system often unfold gradually, sometimes over decades. Yet, when historians look back at such periods, they often recognize that the decisive turning points occurred quietly long before the final outcomes became obvious. Understanding this broader perspective changes the way one interprets events in the Middle East and beyond. The debates about sanctions, shipping lanes, financial systems, and strategic alliances are all part of a deeper contest over how the global order will function in the future. And that is why discussions about geopolitics increasingly revolve around economic architecture rather than purely military strength. The real struggle is not simply about territory or ideology. It is about which countries will shape the financial networks that determine how wealth moves around the world, which currencies dominate global trade, and which governments possess the structural advantages needed to sustain power over the long term.